Hello and welcome to Off My Shelves, and this is a look at Grandville, Intégrale, the complete Grandville by Bryan Talbot. Let's get underway. Now this, just so you know, is the Jonathan Cape edition of this book. There is a different cover for Dark Horse, I think, that published it out in America, but this is obviously the one that's been published in Britain and probably Europe. Guess this version as well, I'm guessing. But this is Grandville, a book that is collecting the story of Lebrock of Scotland Yard, an anthropomorphic badger who is one of the best detectives the world had ever seen, and a ruthless action hero to boot as well. But before I get too far into the story, the build of this book. Now it is a chunk of a book, sewn binding, extremely good binding, really well done, but obviously this is the Cape edition, so the build of this book will differ depending on where you get it and all that, but I think for the most part the Dark Horse edition is the same. Comes with a ribbon bookmark, glossy full coloured pages, and yeah, really high quality book. It collects every Bryan Talbot Grandville story out there, from Grandville to Grandville Monomar, Grandville Bête Noire, Grandville Noël, Grandville Force Majeure, and then there's a lot of annotations at the end and a few other notes by Bryan Talbot on the work and things like that. It's just over 600 pages in total, and so yeah, to the story of Grandville really is the story of our main character, of Lebrock of Scotland Yard, and as Bryan Talbot says, a scientific romance thriller, and it has got all those elements. I'm always kind of impressed by how Bryan Talbot seems to kind of smash so many different genres together, but they work so effortlessly together. So for example, the aesthetic of this world is very much like a steampunk aesthetic. It's set in an anthropomorphic world where humans do exist, but they are second-class citizens. They are the citizens that have been kind of pushed to one side. They call dough faces as a racial slur on them, but they haven't got the same rights as the animals and things like that, but they do exist. But the world itself was dominated by the Napoleonic Wars, and for many years Britain was part of the Napoleonic Empire until recently in the history of the book, where it was given back its independence after lots of bombings and things like that. So the Napoleonic French Empire was a dominant force throughout Europe and in Britain, and so you're catching up in the aftermath of that, seeing how that affects the world itself, how that really takes its toll on the characters and the world and the dynamic of world politics. Grandville in France is one of these central places in the world, but our main character, Lebrock of Scotland Yard, is obviously based in Britain. So in the first story arc, it's him travelling to Grandville, and you get an idea of how Grandville works, what the city's like, but he's investigating the murder of a scientist in Britain, and that leads into a massive conspiracy out in Grandville, and every type of animal you can imagine is worked into this world. It really doesn't leave anyone out, but even later on it starts to bring in mythological and extinct species into the anthropomorphic world, and it does that so great. But our main character, Lebrock, is equal parts Sherlock Holmes and equal parts James Bond. He's a gigantic, tall, beef badger who literally is very hardlined when it comes to criminal, but he is very much this amazing character to watch, because like I say, the same attractions that you have with Sherlock Holmes in his deductive abilities, in his abilities to kind of solve a crime, they're all there for Lebrock. But then again, you've got those high action pieces that you get from a character like James Bond worked in. So, you know, there's big explosions, there's gunfights, there's sword fights, there's fist fights, there's tons of high speed chases and all this type of thing. And he fits in those two worlds brilliantly. It very much is bringing those two character mentalities and ideologies together into this anthropomorphic world, and add to that this layer of this world where you are trying to discover, okay, it's an alternative anthropomorphic world, and the Napoleonic Empire made an impact, but how has that affected the countries now? What is Britain like now? What's France like now? How do the politics work? What's the dominant forces and powers? And all of those things get explored in different ways. And like any good Sherlock Holmes or James Bond book, they always start with, you know, that thread, that intrigue, that scientist being killed, how did he die, all this type of thing. but then it lead into a much wider and larger storyline and much more higher stakes conclusions. And all of the Grandville stories do that exceptionally well. All of them start out with a murder or a disappearance or one of the people being taken into a cult, and then that story getting ever bigger and ever more dangerous, and the stakes rising every time you go forward in a few pages. Each story, I should say, is about 100 or so pages in length, and it doesn't really give you the full story of Lebrock and his backstory right away. They pepper that, layer it through each story arc, and so you get a bit more about his origin, a bit more about who he is and where he came from, how he came to be such an expert detective and such a great fighter and all this type of stuff. You get that as you go through, and you get a big exposition dump, I should say, in the final story, Force Majeure. You get a big exposition dump on his origins, and that's one of the best. Actually, my two favourite stories from this volume were the two last ones, Grandville Noel and Grandville Force Majeure. Why Noel was one of my favourite stories is because it instantly started off with a very different, more unique presence. It explores the religious backgrounds of this world. It starts off following a cult that is led by a unicorn, and I know it sounds mad, but it is really good. And it's following this cult, and this cult is in America, and they take part in a mass suicide initially, and it's all a big con which you get quite early on, and that develops more when the cult come over to Europe and try to establish themselves in Grandville. But then Lebrock's housekeeper, her niece, gets entangled into this cult, and that brings Lebrock's interest, and it explores the religious world of Grandville, how these characters believed that it all started with water, believed that they were the animals coming off the ark and being saved on the ark and then populating the world after. And it's so interesting how Bryan Talbot has kind of incorporated the real religious history of the world into a slightly offshoot world in this anthropomorphic world and change things slightly. But it was great to delve into the religious history of the world while having a missing person as well. And in this one as well, you get a lot of the dough faces, the humans trying to get back their rights and trying to be terrorists, really, to try and take back their rights by force from the animals that are dominating the world. I think more than anything, why I enjoyed these two final stories is it opened the world of Grandville up far more than previous stories. Previous stories were great, intriguing mysteries or murder mysteries, but these final two stories really did bring open this world of Grandville. The final book, Force Majeure, I think I like as well, because you do get a lot of backstory of Lebrock, and you get a lot of his kind of younger childhood, you get a lot of his early days on the force, becoming a detective, being trained by pretty much a Sherlock Holmes type figure, a guy called Hawksmoor. But also it's probably the most intricate kind of crime story, you know, like in Sherlock Holmes when Moriarty comes in and the crime is a little bit more devious to solve, the enemies are coming after you, they're coming after your friends and family, and you have to do really extreme things to combat that. That's what Force Majeure is all about. There's this big gang drug lord, really, that's taken over gangs in London and in France, and he has a vendetta against Lebrock from something he done in previous volumes, and it's him trying to really destroy Lebrock's life, but then watching Lebrock actually try to get the upper hand by using devious tactics of his own. But it was a great end as well, and I should say that you get everything you want from the character in this series of books, really. I kind of hope that he doesn't revisit Grandville at all, really, because it ended so strongly and so well, I think. I can't really see what else he would do with the character, in all honesty, because he does everything. It contains all the different mysteries that you would want from a crime mystery novel. It contains all the world building you want. You get the highs and lows of the character's life. You get a wonderful ending to it all, and yeah, it's a fabulous read. Grandville is definitely one of the better crime books out there, I think, and even though you look at it as maybe an anthropomorphic book that's a bit more fantasy or a bit more this or that, essentially at its heart it is a crime book, and it is a book that's been inspired heavily by the likes of Sherlock Holmes and by James Bond and by other crime action books, really, espionage thrillers, and it's got everything that you would want from one of those books, but you get that added bonus of having really visually interesting characters because it's an anthropomorphic world, and yeah, he does great, and it's not without humour as well, but it's very much well worth a read, I think. But yeah, that's all I've got to say about Grandville by Bryan Talbot. I hope you've enjoyed having a look at it with me. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.